All right, so now that we've wrapped up Cnidaria, let's go ahead and let's talk about mollusks. So what you see on the screen here are some examples of mollusks. So octopus, you have a squid here, you have a snail, and these are all different types of mollusks, and we'll talk about the different phyla, sorry, not phyla, the different classes of mollusks that belong to this phyla, which is called mollusks. Okay, so when we talk mollusks, we're talking about not just octopus and squid, but we're talking about snails, slugs, oysters, clams, and octopus and squid, and all the different varieties of those. So you'll see some bivalves on here, which we'll talk about that class in a second. You see the chambered nautilus on here, which is belonging to the same class as octopus and squid, which is called cephalopods, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well. Some characteristics of all mollusks. All mollusks are soft-bodied invertebrates. They're covered with a protective, what they call mantle. The mantle of the mollusk is the top part of it. It's what secretes the shell. Okay. So if a mollusk has a shell, the shell is directly secreted from what's called the mantle, and it's usually made of calcium carbonate, which is similar composition to like what's in chalk, which is why those shells are chalky. Mollusks in general are the second largest animal phylum, so there are a lot of different species of mollusks out there in existence. And one of the bottom parts of the mollusks, besides the mantle, is referred to as the muscular foot, which we call it the foot in bivalves and gastropods, which we'll talk about those classes in a little bit. But when we look at cephalopods, the foot is modified into tentacles when we're talking about different organisms like squid and octopus. Okay. Some other characters of mollusks, they have a one-way digestive tract. Their digestive tract is complete with both a mouth and an anus. So it's not like Cnidaria where they basically just eat something and then there's nowhere for the food to go, so they spit it back out the same opening with whatever's left. The food that's eaten by mollusks is going to move completely in the tube one way and out the other way. Mollusks are cephalized. If you guys remember that term from chapter 9, that means that they have a distinct head region that has most of the sensory organs as well as a brain. When we looked at Cnidaria and sponges, they had no such cephalization. They didn't have a head with sensory organs and they didn't have a brain either. They have a unique structure called a radula, which is a scraping mouth-like structure. Um, it's kind of like what I like to call a chainsaw tongue is what it looks like. It's used to scrape algae off rocks and such and to grind up food as well. In cephalopods like squid, it's modified into what they call a beak. We're talking about mollusks in general. The vast majority of mollusks are marine. Marine means that they live in the ocean. There are a few species, just gastropods, so slugs and snails, that are terrestrial though, which means that they can live on land. There's also some different species of gastropods, as well as bivalves, which I'll talk about those classes in a minute, that inhabit fresh water as well. But the vast majority of these organisms are going to live in the ocean. There's some slugs and snails and clams and mussels and such that live in fresh water. And then there's also some gastropods that are terrestrial, so slugs and snails. When we talk about some of the other classes of mollusks, no one else besides the gastropods are terrestrial. That's something that's unique to slugs and snails. We talk about how humans use mollusks. Well, the main thing would be we use them for food, right? So maybe you like some of these foods, maybe you don't. They're all pretty delicious if you've had them, I would say. So mussels, clams, oysters, abalone, calamari is squid, octopus, escargot. That's the one thing I guess I wouldn't eat. I don't have um, a desire to eat snails, but squid's good if you ever had it. So are clams. Other uses that we use for mollusks, oysters and clams sometimes form pearls. We use those for jewelry, and sometimes the shiny inner layers of their cells might be shells, not cells, might be used to make buttons. Another way that mollusks affect us is sometimes they're pests. So one species of mollusk that's a bivalve called shipworms burrow through wood and including docks and ships, and they ruin the wood. Some terrestrial slugs and snails damage garden plants, which isn't good if you're a gardener. And a lot of mollusks also serve as an intermediate host for many parasites. By intermediate, it means that they start in that mollusk and then that mollusk might get eaten and that parasite might move on to something else so it was infected. So you always want to make sure that if you do eat mollusks, they're thoroughly cooked so that the parasite would die. Another particular mollusk that's a pest are zebra mussels. We're not talking about like the muscles of a zebra. We're talking about zebra mussels. They're clams. We usually dissect them here at school. They were accidentally introduced into the Great Lakes and they've been wreaking havoc on that ecosystem ever since. As far as the body plan of mollusks go, all mollusks have a similar body plan with three main parts to it. Mollusks have a muscular foot, which is the bottom of the mollusk. They have a middle layer, which is referred to as the visceral mass. This is what contains the digestive tract, the circulatory system, the respiratory system, and other reproductive organs. So, visceral, the organs, this is where all the good stuff is. And then they have the mantle, which, like I already said, is where the protective shell is secreted if they have a shell. This is over or on top of the visceral mass, and this is where the gills are housed as well. So the foot's the bottom, the visceral mass is the middle, where all the organs are basically. Then the mantle will be the top, where the shell is secreted and where the gills are. If you look at the mollusk body plan here, so again, the bottom, here's the muscular foot, here's the visceral mass with everything inside of it, here's the mantle where the shell is secreted, okay? This feather-like organ is the gills here. That would be where the mantle's at as well. This is pretty cool down here. This is actually a scallop, and all these little blue spots here are eyes. So most mollusks have a very well-developed head region. They're cephalized, like we said, that have sensory structures. Bivalves aren't cephalized as far as the mollusks go. Gastropods and cephalopods are. Cephalopods, cephalized, okay, similar word. They have a head. The word cephalopod, when we talk about cephalopods, actually translates to head foot because they're basically just a head and a foot. Okay, but most mollusks have a well-developed head and sensory structures, uh, and they may have simple light detectors or complex eyes. So the eyes of a squid, for instance, as well as the eyes on the scallops are very good. If we talk more about mollusks, I already mentioned that they have a structure called the radula. This is a rasping, tongue-feeding-like structure. I call it kind of a chainsaw tongue because if you kind of look at it, that looks chainsaw, right? Those are the teeth of it. It's found in most mollusks except for bivalves, so like clams or anything with two shells. Bivalve, two shells. Bi means two. They have this for feeding off algae and grinding up food. So it has tiny rows of teeth for scraping. We talk about the shells of mollusks. Snails have shells. Bivalves have shells. The word bivalve means two shells or two valves. It's referring to two shells. Chitons, that's how that's said, Chiton, chitons, as well as the chambered nautilus is basically a squid with a shell. Like I said, this is made of calcium carbonate, the same stuff that goes in chalk or Tums if you've ever eaten Tums at home. It's also in limestone. That's how it gets those chalky characteristics. And the shell in mollusk is secreted by the mantle. On here, it's just showing you a variety of mollusk shells that you might be looking at. If we want to talk about the internal structure and function of mollusks, many mollusks have what they call an open circulatory system. This is a lot different than a closed circulatory system. We have a closed circulatory system in the human body. So our circulatory system, our blood isn't all over the place in our body. It runs through veins and arteries, so it's closed off from the rest of our body as far as blood vessels go. But in mollusks like clams and such, the circulatory system is open, so the blood kind of just goes all over the place to nourish the rest of the body with oxygen and other things that come into the blood. Most cephalopods, though, like squid and octopus, are actually a lot more advanced than the majority of mollusks, and they have a closed circulatory system. So they have a heart and they have blood vessels and capillaries. So the vast majority of mollusks have this open circulatory system, which is more primitive. Blood's just all over the place to nourish the rest of the cells in the body. But cephalopods, the most advanced mollusks that we'll talk about, they actually have a closed off circulatory system like we do. On here, it talks a little bit about what's called the mantle cavity. That's here. It's this opening. It's the space between the mantle and the visceral mass. It's called the mantle cavity. Cavity is an opening, like a cavity in your tooth would be an opening. Okay. Um, it's the space between the mantle and the visceral mass, as I said. This is where the gills are, and this is where the lungs will be. If you have lungs like snails, this would be where they're generally housed or where they're at. When we look at mollusks and we talk about mollusks, we're going to talk about four different classes of mollusks. So we're talking about kingdom Animalia once again, so animals, right? Where the phylum we're talking about is mollusks. I've said that word a lot during this lecture so far. And the four major classes that we're going to focus on are Polyplacophora. We're not going to talk about this one that much, so this one's not going to get a lot of attention. This is basically just your chitons. The ones that we'll mainly focus on are the other three gastropods, so gastropoda, which are your snails and slugs, bivalvia, or your bivalves, two valves or two shells. These are your clams, mussels, oysters, etc. And then cephalopoda, or your cephalopods, which I said that the word cephalopod basically translates to head, foot. This is your octopus as well as your squid. Okay. And we're going to split this lecture into two parts because I'm not going to be able to finish all in one go. So the next section of the lecture, we're going to talk about the four major mollusk classes.